with hundreds of people working every hour they possibly can to make this racing car fast, competitive, and a championship winner. Was it great to be back in Australia, especially with such humongous crowds? And did it exceed your expectations? Just a big resounding yes to both of those. It was fantastic to be back. It's been a couple of years, and the crowds in Australia, there's other venues around the world that are similar with the amount of magnitude of people coming in. Silverstone, Monza, I can think of straight away off the top of my head, and Australia didn't disappoint. You had over 100,000 people, I think, all days. I think nearly 500,000 people from Thursday onwards. You have racing from Wednesday all the way through to Sunday, whereas of course at most places perhaps the track isn't used till Friday. And the people there love it. You can hear the cheers, you can hear the roars, and you can just hear how much they've missed having Formula One on their shores, and it was great to be there. How did Lewis end up overcutting Perez? For that really to be understood, we need to look at that first stint of the race. Near enough everyone was on that medium tyre. The medium tyre had quite high degradation for a number of cars, especially on the Red Bulls. It came from the front axle. It's something we highlighted from Friday, and as a result we were driving it very carefully, especially in the opening laps of the stint. And that paid dividends towards the end of the stint. You can see Perez came back towards Lewis incredibly quickly, and they had to react. They had to stop. What we knew from Friday is that hard tyre had a lot of warm-up. It was very difficult to get working. In fact, on Friday, it took us 2 to 3 laps before we could really get a half-decent lap time out of it. So when Perez came out, he was actually now slower than where Lewis was, quite a bit slower, over a second off, as it turns out. And what we then did is Lewis is in free air. His tyres were actually not bad condition at all, given he looked after them so well, and we let him push on to see what we can do. The reason for staying out is it gives you a few opportunities. One, you get to see, is that hard tyre warm-up, even when it's warm, still going to be offset in terms of performance to the medium? So potentially we can extend it further with Lewis. That was question number one. Number two is we can actually see what Lewis can now do in free air by himself. What lap times can he achieve? And is it good enough to do more than just fight Perez? And the final one is it gives you a tiny bit more safety car coverage at a track where very clearly there is a strong risk of VSCs, yellows and safety cars. Once Perez had done the outlap, it was clear that he was struggling. But at the beginning of his next lap, you could start to see that the tyres were working now. Now that was on expectations. And as a result of that, we covered with Lewis to put him out ahead on track. We knew it would be difficult for him to hold back Perez. There was a big car performance difference between the two, and the hard tyre was more resilient. It wasn't going to damage itself and degrade in the same way as that medium did. And that's what transpired. Lewis really did his best to defend, but ultimately couldn't hold Perez behind. What had been the planned strategy for George before he pitted? George and Lewis, and in fact really everyone in the top 10, was on a planned one-stop strategy, starting on medium, going to hard sometime between lap 18 to lap 24, something in that range. With George, Norris was the threat. Norris had already stopped, he had taken the hard tyre, he had gone through the warm-up slope and he was starting to get quicker and quicker, so we had to react. We boxed George on the very same lap that the yellow came out and then the safety car came out. So ultimately our planned strategy was exactly what happened, but we were fortunate with the safety car. When you stop under safety car conditions, you gain a significant amount of race time relative to those that couldn't, and that put George ahead of Perez and Lewis. Why did you say to George on the second stint of the race to let Perez go and not to race him? It's a subtlety, but it's an important one. It's not so much that we asked George to let Perez go. We never want to give up on position. But these tyres, both the medium but also the hard tyre, required a good amount of management, a good amount of looking after them to make sure they can make the end of the race without dropping off the curve. You saw that happen with Perez on stint 1. And the message to George was very simple. Look after your tyres. And if that costs a position to Perez on track, then we don't want it with all our heart, but it's the right thing to do. Because ultimately getting to the end of the race on tyres that we know will make it, what covers you off against safety cars and other circumstances, is the right course of action, especially given what happened on the medium in stint 1. We had also expected that Perez, with the pace he was doing and the amount he was pushing the tyres, could well have a repeat of what happened on stint 1. But ultimately that didn't happen. He pulled away from 5 seconds from George, actually overtook him fairly easily in the end, and there was no race there for us to have. What did Lewis mean when he said we had put him in a difficult position? That was all about engine cooling and keeping the PU cool during the course of the race. We push everything to the limit, as you would imagine, and one of those is engine cooling. And you do that by closing up the bodywork or changing the louvre design at the back of the car. That decision is made on Saturday, but obviously we're racing on Sunday, 24 hours later. And in this particular circumstance, the ambient was 1, maybe 2 degrees warmer than we had expected. And as a result of that, ourselves, and not just ourselves, you would have heard it for teams up and down the grid, were right on the limit of what the engine and the PU can take in terms of cooling requirements. And during the course of the race, when you're following a car, it meant that Lewis had to compromise what he was doing. He had to move out of the dirty air of the car in front of him and make sure we got cool, clean air through the radiators to drop the PU temperatures down. But doing that makes racing a car in front incredibly difficult, and that's why his message came out. The car pace looked decent in Australia. Is that a function of improvements that you've made, or is that a function of the track layout of Australia? I think really the truth lies between those two factors. Track to track, definitely the performance moves up and down between Ferrari, Red Bull, ourselves, McLaren, for example. You can see teams moving up and down between all of those different circuits as the circuit characteristics, the downforce level, either suits or doesn't suit a characteristic of their car. We've also made steps and been trying to make steps in our car every single race to move it forward and understand it. In terms of where we were though in Melbourne, we have to face the reality. We were a second down in qualifying relative to Ferrari, and in the race, Leclerc was in a league of his own. He wasn't challenged by Verstappen at the restart. Just a few laps in, Verstappen had already dropped a few seconds back, and then obviously on stint 2 wasn't there. And the Red Bull suffered that large degradation you saw on the medium tyre, but on the hard were a much faster tyre. Bahrain ended up being, still to this point in our season, our most competitive race, as an example, as a gap relative to the front. Every race, though, that we move forward, we have a plan of action on what we need to test, try, and develop on the car. Now, I'm sure all of our competitors have the same thing, but the key is this: we have to start clawing back that gap to the front. Did you manage to get some good data off the extra sensors that Lewis was running on his car during the course of the race? The answer is yes. We always need to have a good understanding and be data-driven as an organization. And it was painful because taking sensors off the car because the car is too heavy means we're losing out on information. And what we concluded from the first 2 races is we had too many questions without answers as a result of doing so. In a normal year, you wouldn't even consider not having sensors on the car. You would add what you need to make sure you understand what's going on. But obviously this isn't a normal year and the car is overweight. In terms of how it worked between the 2 cars, there are thousands of components that make up the racing car for George and for Lewis. And those components don't weigh exactly the same amount. There's variability of a few grams here and there. And the actual car weight, as measured on the FIA scales between the 2 cars in the race, was within a few grams of each other. So Lewis did a fantastic job by carrying these extra sensors. Ultimately, the cost was small. It was a matter of grams between the 2, which is what we wanted. To answer the bulk of the question though, have we got good data? Absolutely. It's not that from this you can suddenly find something that will turn everything on its head and we'll find a solution in one race, but it provides clues and understanding of what we need to do to move forwards. What will you be focusing on these 2 weeks now between Melbourne and Imola? It's a good question. I think often people see the race team on TV and think that's the entire team. It's not. We're fortunate to have a base in Brackley and in Brixworth with hundreds of people working every hour they possibly can to make this racing car fast, competitive, and a championship winner. The work that goes on between races is enormous. There's turnaround of components, there's upgrades, there's understanding of problems that we have and how do we move the performance forward, both on the PU side and also on the chassis side. Imola's going to be a challenging event. It's our first sprint race of the season. So unlike previous events where we've had FP1, FP2 and FP3 really to get to grips with the car and test how we're going to improve the car performance, we now just have one free practice session, and that free practice session dominates what happens in qualifying and in the race. So it's very limited in terms of what we can learn and what we can do. When we get back to the European season, teams would generally bring more performance upgrades, and I suspect you'll see an evolution of our competitors, and we need to make sure we, at the very minimum, keep up with that. So the work that takes place now is a review of what's happened in Melbourne and an understanding of what we need to do going forward into Imola and progress the car into a championship winner. What will you be focusing on? Well, I think that came out in a different language. Was it great to be back in Australia? So it's the...
Well, a great start.
Brilliant start. Thank you for all of your questions, and we look forward to answering them again in 2 weeks' time after Imola.